I'd like to welcome everybody to today's Cymulate webinar. As security professionals, we all know that every day presents us with new headlines featuring the latest organizations to be breached and new alerts from organizations like CISA with details of the latest emerging threats. And as these new alerts and threats happen, we get asked the question, are we exposed to these threats and what is our level of risk? My name's Paul Ashwood, and I'm joined today by Dan Lasichkin, who's one of our threat researchers here at Cymulate. Welcome, Dan.
Nice to be here, Paul.
Thanks. For our discussion today, we're going to talk through the challenges associated with new threats that emerge every single day. We'll take a look at some recent CISA alerts and break down the notable threat activity that you may have heard or read about in the headlines. And our main purpose here today is really to discuss how to answer the call. So when we do get asked the question, are we exposed to these threats? We can answer that question with confidence. We'll cover what we believe to be a best practice of simulating real-world attacks in order to assess these threats and validate if we do in fact have exposure to an immediate threat and what our exposure level might actually look like. So Dan, the challenge we all face here is the overwhelming volume of attacks and new threats that are occurring on a daily basis. And as a researcher who's tapped into the threat intel community, can you give us some perspective on the magnitude of this problem as you see it?
Yeah, sure. And besides what is being published everywhere all the time, just raw statistics about the amount of things you see in the slides, the cyber attacks per day, the CVEs per day. There is also a lot of attacks that don't go on record. You can specifically know them just by being in the inner circles of researchers, where a lot of high profile attacks are not being disclosed. It's definitely overwhelming. There's so much to talk about all the time, and it's definitely the classic cat and mouse chase where you think you got something covered and you are using your best defenses, and then something new happens, and you see that every day. You can definitely see that in the amount of immediate threats we upload every day to the platform. There's just so much, and there isn't enough time to also cover everything and get and understand everything that's going on all the time, which is one of the biggest challenges of being a threat intelligence researcher, is just being updated with all the things that happen all the time.
You know, for security leaders and their confidence level, you know, it's difficult to be confident when you're facing this kind of volume of 2,000 cyber attacks every day. You know, there's been over 100 new CVs every day. I think we're at over 30,000, approaching 40,000 for the year 2024. And, you know, we see that stat there, 66% of organizations are unable to detect a breach. So from, you know, anybody who's in a security leadership role, having that confidence of can we defend ourselves against the latest emerging threats, you can understand why they're saying why we're at 4% there.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know a lot of confident CISOs.
Yeah,
I don't think they exist.
you know, it's interesting. I was reading just yesterday a Forbes article about how Microsoft alone is blocking some 7,000 password attacks every second, right? Every second, that is, you know, that's over 600 million attacks on Microsoft passwords occurring every single day. And in that article, they were saying that that number has doubled from a year ago. So, you know, when we're dealing with this type of volume of attacks and new vulnerabilities, new threats, it just seems overwhelming.
Yeah, and it's probably not going to change. It's probably going to get even worse as more people get access to more computing power, more bots, more AI would make it easier. So I don't see it necessarily becoming easier.
Absolutely. So I think we all have pretty good sense of the volumes and challenges as security leaders that we face every day. Let's talk more specifically about CISA alerts and take a look at some recent notable examples and what it is we can actually do about those. So we have two examples here, and the first one was actually a CISA alert that was released on October 16 around this Iranian cyber threat. What can you tell us about this particular threat actor, Dan?
In general, Iran is a very active country when it comes to cybersecurity, actively targeting the Middle East quite often, but also does not shy away from Europe and North America. They work a lot with psychological operations, mostly in the Middle East, with these ransomware attacks where they don't really ransom you, but try to wipe your system and make these attacks as much public as possible, so the domestic audiences of their victim countries would be very aware of what's going on.
They're really looking to disrupt operations of organizations.
Yeah, and they try to make it. I would say they go out their own way to publicize these operations as much as possible.
Yeah.
Even by contacting journalists online, just showing them what they did. A lot of political espionage, a lot of espionage just in general. I wouldn't say their tools are very sophisticated, but you definitely see from a historical perspective that they just get better every year. Maybe it's because Iran, well, also they're a smart nation and they also have access to Russian training now that they have signed a lot of agreements with Russia. So you can see their cyber capabilities are definitely getting better. With this specific alert, there is a lot of, I think what's unique about it is the MFA, the multi-factor authentication spamming, where they would get credential access to specific accounts, and when they would see their MFA blocked, they would spam the user to get approved. I think it was during the night, they would just send tons of requests for approval, and eventually the user just caves in and lets them in.
So I would say plays a role there. Yeah.
So I said that was the big initial access kind of unique attack in this. Their malware is not very sophisticated, but once they're in, they're already in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for any organization that is basically running critical infrastructure, like I said, they're looking to really disrupt those operations on those countries. Let's take a look at our second example here regarding Akira ransomware. And whilst the CISA alert for this came out in April, some 8 months ago, Akira was recently in the headlines 3-4 weeks ago, where they actually released onto their darknet site the data from 30 plus victim organizations. And so I think this is part of their double extortion tactics, where they've originally gone in and ransomed an environment. Possibly those organizations didn't pay, and so they released their data onto the darknet site and use that double extortion tactics. What else can you tell us about this Akira threat actor organization?
Definitely one of the more sophisticated ransomware operations. They use unpatched exploits, just day one exploits. They use LOL bins, So they bring also legitimate tools in the environments they breach, like ArcLone, AnyDesk, and various IP scanners that might be used by the IT team, so they won't be detected. But they are it's definitely possible to deal with their attacks. And are we going to do that right now, or we're just gonna go through that a bit later?
Yeah. I think this threat group has been responsible for some 250 attacks on organizations, successful attacks in the last about 18 months. They've reportedly extorted some $42 million in ransom payments. They've been affiliated with the former Conti ransomware group, and they're operating their Akira ransomware as a service. So there are other threat actor affiliates that are also leveraging that Akira ransomware. Okay, let's move forward. And, organizations invest a lot of time and resources putting the right security controls in place to stop these kinds of attacks. But how do you know if those controls are operating as intended and capable of stopping an attack like Akira? If you think about the two CISA alerts that we just talked about, and we would ask the question to everybody in our audience here, are you exposed? Would you be able to answer that question with confidence? As we were promoting this webinar on LinkedIn, we also conducted some polling questions. You may have seen them to find out just how confident people were in their security defenses. And one of the initial questions indicated that a large percentage, about 90% of organizations, felt somewhat confident that their defenses could stop these types of threats. But when we ask a further question specifically about Akira, and would they be able to stop an Akira ransomware attack, about 2/3 of those organizations said not sure. So not really confident on specific attacks, while they do believe in the controls that they've put in place and the resources that they have defending their organization, but not against specific attacks. So here at Cymulate, we say don't speculate, validate. So you might think that your controls are configured correctly and capable of stopping an Akira ransomware attack, but the only way to really know for sure is to simulate that attack and actually validate that, yes, the compensating security controls will in fact block the attack. Of course, there is one other way, and that's to wait until you actually get attacked by Akira to find out if that your controls failed to do their job. We certainly don't recommend that approach. So Dan, tell us more about your role here at Cymulate, what your team does, and the role that you guys play in validating emerging threats.
So our team is responsible for uploading immediate threats to the platform, which allows you to simulate these attacks based on IOCs within these breaches. We actively sit and collect data and blogs from the internet, and we bring these threats after researching them onto the immediate threat platform. Additionally, if there are some unique attacks related to these intrusions, we create attack scenarios, real simulations of unique attacks on the platform. We put it in the advanced scenarios. So there's quite a bit of red teaming actually going into threat, with a lot of red teaming going into researching these threats and then simulating them, allowing our clients to simulate them on the platform.
Okay. And every day you're loading new threats into the platform. I've seen at least one a day. I've seen several days where there might be 5, 6, 7, even 8 threats and get loaded into the platform. So this is a daily occurrence.
Yes. When it comes to high risk threats, they get instantly uploaded like CISA alerts. And when it comes to just interesting attacks with interesting TTPs, they also get uploaded. So at least once a day. But if a lot of things happen in one day, then many times a day.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. We talk about validating immediate threats within the Cymulate platform. We looked at 2 examples earlier around the Iranian cyber threat actor and the Akira ransomware. So these were actually immediate threats that were loaded into the Cymulate platform. Typically, that's occurring within 24 hours of those high-risk threats being published. In this case, they were published on CISA, and we took those threats and through Dan's organization, loaded them into the Cymulate platform. And these immediate threats can be set for auto run, which means that anytime a new threat gets loaded, it's automatically going to get scheduled for an assessment against that organization. And in the case of, if there's exposure, then there's going to be notifications to certain people that they're exposed to that threat. So let's take a look at what that looks like and what sort of insight we can gain from immediate threats, starting with our Iranian threat actor here. What you're seeing here is some of the insight that we gain out of the platform when we run an immediate threat assessment. First off, in this case, the assessment is simulating the attack using the same set of IOCs, the same types of activities that the Iranian threat actor is using. We're testing and validating whether or not the web gateway and the endpoint security controls can actually detect the malicious payloads that are being used here. In this case, whilst we were exposed, it did come back that we do have exposure. When we look at the score is relatively low at 7%, which in our world really represents minimal level of risk. What's more interesting here, though, is looking at the penetration ratio. So here we see 2 out of 28. So there's actually 27 either malicious URLs or malicious payloads sent through the web gateway, and 1 that was sent through the endpoint, whether that's the next gen AV solution or the EDR solution, whatever solution you have in place. We're actually testing through that endpoint security to see if it can detect and block. As we kind of take that down a level, Dan, and look at the results here, again, we see the web gateway did a pretty good job of blocking the malicious links. There was 26 links that we used in the assessment. Several of those, 14 of those, were actually offline at the time, so the threat actor has probably either taken those down, but they're not active. The ones that were active, though, were all blocked. The big concern here, though, is the one malicious file that actually penetrated the gateway and the endpoint controls. So what can you tell us about that particular file?
Not much. This file is the actual ransomware. Sorry, it's not ransomware. It's the malware that the Iranians are using, part of their tooling. It's very highly detected on VirusTotal, just in general. So if you're getting penetrated by this file specifically, it's probably not a good sign that your security controls are working. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be even just passing through, strolling along into your system. It shouldn't happen. If you have proper security controls, there's no way it's going to get in. Yeah, just malware, just very highly detectable malware.
And just to be clear, we're actually using, these results came from our lab environment. So, we don't specifically know the configuration of our lab environment, what was set up in the web gateway, what was set up in the endpoint. The real key point here, though, is this is the insight that any organization will get when they run this immediate threat against their environment, against their web gateway, against their endpoint controls. And hopefully, those results will come back with, if not 0%, at least blocking this share audit.exe file. Let's move on and talk a little bit more about Akira. This particular threat here had a lot more steps within the assessment. And as we look at kind of the high level results, again, this is out of our lab environment, but again, we see exposure through the web gateway, through the endpoint security controls. In this case, we would be concerned because we've got our score is 69%. Our exposure level is high risk. We see the web gateway did not stop anything. 8 out of 8 activities that we tested all bypassed the web gateway. The endpoint security controls did a little better in blocking 5 of those, but 3 of those did actually pass through. Let's kind of break down what Akira is using in terms of malicious payloads. And Dan, if you could kind of walk us through, what would concern you here if you're a security operations leader.
This data is actually, it's very conflicting to a lot of people, I would say, which is kind of creates a few questions. I'll elaborate a little bit. So all the red files are being blocked because they are actually the Akira ransomware, which is fine. They shouldn't be penetrating into the system. But then you have AnyDesk, the RRQ, and the IP scan. Now, these are legitimate tools. I know a lot of IT admins who use AnyDesk. IP scan is the advanced IP scanner, and RRQ is rclone. So it's always a big conflict because sometimes IT admins, they use some of these tools in a legitimate way. The problem is that also threat actors use these tools, and then if the IT admins use them, they find the threat actors can just blend in the traffic more easily, and these files will not be blocked because it's fine.
Right.
They're allowed. I would say that one solution would definitely be excluding some of these files, at least. Like, there's no good reason for IT admins to be using tools like advanced IP scanner. I don't understand why they would use that, but some people do. Maybe you should find some replacements for this specific tool because it's highly used by threat actors, even though it's very utilized also by IT admins, but that can be solved pretty easily. rclone is a bit more difficult because I know this tool is also being used a lot to move files around. Threat actors use it to exfiltrate information from the organization using various protocols. Again, you as an IT admin, I don't know what are the best policies you should put into the organization, but IT admins should be definitely aware that these tools are being used by threat actors. So maybe allowing only specific users to use rclone. Maybe rclone should be only be on specific systems within the organization, and not every user should be having rclone on their system. But at least maybe trigger some alerts on the usage of rclone just so the security teams would be notified that it's being used. Regarding AnyDesk, it's also a very useful remote control tool. Again, you should be asking yourself as an IT admin, do I need to really use this? Are there any other tools I can use? Maybe there's should be some policies I could put on so only the IT admins can be utilizing that tool. But again, if the threat actor would somehow find this out, and they can find out if they're already in the system and they can somehow view your policies, they can definitely find out that some users are allowed to use AnyDesk, and maybe they can find some smart actors. Some actors are smarter than others, and maybe they can find credentials for that user and then use AnyDesk. So there's a lot of consideration and a lot of questions that need to be asked. I don't always think that organizations should be blocking AnyDesk or rclone. Definitely Advanced IP Scanner, but AnyDesk and rclone, it's definitely a big question, and it's something you should take back home and ask and consult your CISA, or maybe have an open discussion about this at least. I'm more hawkish. I personally don't I don't think these files should, I don't think these tools should be utilized within the system. But then again, I'm not an IT admin. That's not my job. So I'm not experiencing the problems that they would get.
Yeah. So, as we kind of look back at our results here, the key message is to kind of analyze these results, look at these files, things like Megazord. You would definitely want to have configuration and policies in place to block Megazord and Locker. Those are the malicious files that are actually the ones causing the damage. So just a little side note here, when I was loading these slides into our BrightTalk platform here, it actually would not let me load the slides because there was AnyDesk or all of the .exe executables. It recognized them as ransomware files and malware files. So it actually blocked me from loading my slideware. So I had to go and put that little space character between the .exe and all of the file names in order to let it load. So I guess kudos to BrightTalk for actually putting these types of security controls in place. Okay, let's move along here. What we're looking at here is an overview of all of the organizations within Cymulate that actually ran this particular immediate threat for Akira ransomware. And what this is telling me is that on average, 52% of organizations actually had a pretty high penetration ratio, or the penetration ratio was on average 52% across organizations. So what that really means is that organizations in general are not that well equipped to stop Akira ransomware within their controls. So there's work that needs to happen in order to go into those web gateways, go into those EDR solutions, and actually configure and block more of the files that are involved with Akira ransomware. We did see that some of the organizations who ran this assessment, who then undertook some of the remediation actions, so implemented rules, implemented additional policies, blocked specific files, they were actually able to reduce their risk score by an average of 30 basis points over the course of 30 days since conducting their initial assessment. And so, this is kind of the value of leveraging the Cymulate platform in understanding where your exposures lie, implementing some of the remediation actions and guidance that is provided, and then rerunning that assessment to see that you've brought down your score and ultimately brought down your risk. We just recently, about a week ago, ran this for Black Basta ransomware. There was an article that was released over in Europe. British Telecom was reportedly hacked by the Black Basta ransomware group. So we ran the same level of assessment using our immediate threat for Black Basta. And it came back with an average penetration ratio of just 15%, which is actually very good in our world. And so, you know, obviously organizations have taken those steps, familiar with Black Basta, have implemented the configuration into their controls to stop the different payloads that Black Basta would use, but not so much with Akira. So anybody out there listening to our webinar today, you know, you might want to take a little more in-depth look at Akira if you feel concerned about that threat and not so confident that your controls could block it. Go take a look at the payloads that are associated with that. So ultimately, you know, it comes back to our key message when you're facing these types of threats and you're getting asked the question, are we exposed? You know, don't speculate. Don't sit there and say, we think our security controls could defend against this, but actually validate. So run these real world attack simulations against your environment. And with that, you know, you're ultimately going to receive a report that tells you exactly where you're exposed, if you are exposed. And you know, it gives you the ability to go back to your executive leadership, and sometimes even it's the board that's asking the question. It gives you the ability to go back with confidence, with evidence that says, hey, we're not exposed. Or in some cases, we are exposed and we need to make some additional investments in order to reduce that risk. So by running this validation, you know, validation is really what is providing the filter needed for true exposure. You might have vulnerabilities that exist in your environment. You know they're there. You know they need to be patched, but it's not that simple to just patch them immediately. But how do you know if your compensating security controls will actually block that threat so that a threat actor cannot exploit that particular vulnerability? So if your controls actually block the threat, then, you know, is it really a high risk threat that you need to pay immediate attention to? We don't think it is. So running validation is that filter that's really needed to drive down to a specific set of true exposures that you can have your security operations team focused on. So with that, we're going to take a look and see if we have any questions out here today. And take a second. So the first question here is, how do people get notified if they're exposed to a new threat? I think I can answer this one, Dan. Essentially, when you set up auto run within the immediate threat module within the Cymulate platform, you'll actually be notified via email whenever you have exposure to a new immediate threat. And in that email will be the report that tells you exactly where your exposures are. And you'll have the ability to control which email addresses receive that. So you can be sending that to all of your security leadership there. There's a tool here, a question here, Dan, asking about what tools do we recommend instead of advanced IP scanners and AnyDesk?
I want to take that question to the different direction. There's no, like, I'm not an IT admin, and I don't know what kind of problems IT admins have. It's all about how much risk do you want to introduce into your environment, and how are you going to handle that risk you just introduced. So I personally don't know any other tool. Like, advanced IP scanner, it scans IPs. It tries to find more services on that IP. I would say it's like Nmap. And AnyDesk is a remote administration tool. If you want to introduce less risk, maybe pay for a good software that would provide you these services. I know that Cymulate offers ASMs. I'm not trying to market Cymulate, but I know Cymulate does offer ASM, which allows you to scan your assets and find all possible, maybe most of your assets that are related to your organization, but you can't always pay. And it comes down to how much risk do you want to introduce. If you're introducing this risk, you need to be sure that only privileged users can use these tools. If anyone can use them willy-nilly in any endpoint on your network, you're introducing even more risk. So I would say if you want to introduce risk, make sure you can mitigate and edge against the risk you're introducing. So, and I think that's a better answer to this question rather than just offering you different tools that you can use instead. Because, one day some actor could just wake up and be like, oh, I'll just use these tools because that's what I want to do. And they always do this. They find some new tool that no other threat actor used before, and then they go in and used it. So it's kind of working against the unknowns, the unknown unknowns. So have a way to know what kind of risk you're introducing. So, know what kind of tools you have on your organization and who's using them, and have a way to edge and mitigate the risk you introduced. And if you can do that, then I guess you can introduce any tool into the system. Even if I personally don't like it, but
Okay.
not an IT admin.
We have another question here, Dan, on can you only validate CISA alerts or can you do other sources of threat intel? Obviously we can validate alerts from multiple sources. You actually use multiple sources, not just CISA alerts, right?
Everything.
Yeah. And just further to that, we've just recently released this feature called the AI Attack Planner, where you could be sitting there looking at any blog, any article about a threat that's just been released, and you can actually take the URL from that article and paste it straight into the AI Attack Planner, and it will actually build you a simulation, a threat assessment for that specific attack. And it takes just a couple of minutes to build out that complete simulation. You can then go run that assessment, another couple of minutes. And so within minutes, you can find out if your environment is exposed to a threat that you may have read about that may really concern you. So that's a pretty neat feature that has been recently added to the platform.
Indeed.
Yeah. One final question before we end our session today. Does Cymulate provide recommendations on how to mitigate exposures to new threats? Absolutely, we do. You can actually download the IOCs, or you can actually push the IOCs down to your EDR solution as an example. We give guidance on detection rules, and you can actually output those for your preferred EDR environment, where you might want to leverage a detection rule to block specific threats, as well as a set of remediation actions that you might want to take, where you might want to be patching against certain CVEs and those sort of things. But one of the things of most value, I think, is having those detection rules, because we're not going to be able to patch every CVE. but by putting rules in place where our controls will actually block the threat, regardless of whether it's patched or not. So anything you need to add to that, Dan?
No, I think you said everything.
All righty. Well, hey, I appreciate you jumping on the call with us today, Dan, and giving us your insights.
Happy to be here.
And thank you to our audience. Hopefully you gain some value out of this. And, you know, we recognize the challenges you face every day, and through validation solutions is how we can give you that level of confidence to say, hey, we are not exposed to this type of attack. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.